The fog came off the Ohio River the way it always did in October, low and slow, sliding up Bijou Street until it touched the boy's shoes. He stood across from the theater and did not move. In one hand he held a folded deed gone soft at the creases, in the other a brass key on a ring worn thin by other hands. He was 19 years old. He had $68 to his name. He had a borrowed truck that needed returning by dark, and he owned the building in front of him, the one with the caved-in roof and the dead marquee. He could not yet have told you why. The theater was called the Bijou. The plaster letters above the door had lost half their paint, so the sign read more like a breath than a word. A blue tarp covered the back corner of the roof where something had fallen in years ago. One bulb on the marquee still burned, even in daylight, even after all that time. Jonah Carrick had bought a ruin. That was the word the man at the courthouse had used. A ruin, going to tax sale, minimum bid $5, and nobody in their right mind would want it. He had wanted it. He could not have said the reason out loud. The reason had not been written down anywhere he was able to read. He would learn it in time. But that came later, in a small room behind the stage that no living person had walked into in years. First came the morning at the courthouse, the folding chair, and the 5 $1 bills he counted out twice because his hands would not stay still. The auction had been held in the basement of the Ohio County Courthouse. The room had a drop ceiling and a coffee maker that had not worked since spring. There were 9 people in it at 7:42 that morning, and 8 of them had come for the lots out by the interstate. He had only learned about it 3 days before. The notice had been taped to a corkboard at the men's shelter on Wheeling Island, half hidden behind a flyer for a church coat drive. Most of the men walked past it without slowing. Jonah had read it twice, the way he read everything twice. The words theater and $5 had stayed with him through the night, the way a tune does when you would rather it left you alone. A woman from the state auditor's office read each parcel aloud from a binder. She read the legal description first, the metes and bounds, the way these things were set down before anyone used lot numbers. Then she read the back taxes owed, the years they had gone unpaid, and the lowest bid the county would take to clear the lien. When she came to the Bijou, she paused. She read the address on Bijou Street. She read the assessed value, which was close to nothing, and the condition note which said unsafe structure, partial roof failure. Then she said the minimum bid was $5. She looked up over her glasses the way a person does when they already know how a question will end. Any interest in the theater lot? No one moved. A man near the front folded his newspaper into a square. A chair creaked somewhere behind him. Jonah raised his hand from the back row, and the woman looked at him a moment longer than she had looked at anyone else that morning. "You understand what you're bidding on, son. There's a redemption period, 18 months. If the prior owner's people come forward and pay the back taxes, the property goes back to the estate. You'd get your money returned, not the building." "There's no estate," Jonah said. "I called and asked. The man who owned it passed in 2019. No will that anybody could find." She studied him for a second. Then she wrote something in the binder and said the word sold. It was the first time in 19 years that anyone had handed Jonah Carrick a thing that belonged only to him. He paid at the clerk's window. 5 $1 bills, soft and warm from his pocket. He counted them out, then counted them again, because his hands had a way of moving on their own when something mattered, and the counting steadied them. The clerk slid back a certificate of sale, a property packet in a manila folder, and a brass key that someone had left at the county office years before and never come for. The truck belonged to the shelter. The director had loaned it on one condition, that Jonah have it back with a full tank by nightfall. He drove south along the river with the windows cracked. The smell that came in was wet leaves and cold water, with something mineral underneath. It was the smell of a river that had carried bordages of coal and sheet glass for 100 years. Now it mostly carried itself. On the seat beside him sat everything he owned: a canvas bag of clothes, a phone with a spiderweb screen, and a small Bible, worn soft at the spine, that had been his mother's. He had not kept the Bible for what was printed in it. He had kept it for the handwriting in the margins, which was hers. The foster homes had taught him to read the straight letters and never the slanted ones. So he had taught himself the slanted ones alone, tracing her loops with one finger until he could read every word she had underlined. He did not pray over it, he read her. That was a different thing. Linton came up after 40 miles in a bend of the river where the hills pulled in close. There had been a glass works here once. The smokestack still stood, gray and cold, the way a hand stays up in the air after the person has stopped waving. Main Street had a diner, a hardware store, 3 churches, and a long row of dark windows where stores used to be. There was no traffic light anywhere in the town. A banner hung across the road, sun-bleached past reading, that said Coal and Rail Days. The date had washed away, and the festival, Jonah would come to learn, had not been held in over 10 years. He turned at the corner of Bijou Street and Lockwood Avenue, and there it was, the theater he had bought without ever laying eyes on it. The building that was already most of the way back into the ground. He sat in the truck for a while before he got out. He was good at sitting still. It was the first skill the world had ever taught him, and the one it had taught him hardest. The deed in his hand said the lot ran 60 feet by 140. It said the property had been conveyed in 1986 to one W. Carrick, and it said the same W. Carrick had let it pass to the county for want of $7,000 in back taxes after his death. Jonah read the name 3 times. It was his own name. It was not a common one in this corner of the state, and he had grown up believing there was no one anywhere who would claim it with him. He folded the deed and slid it into his coat against the Bible, and he crossed the empty street toward the door he now held a key to. It was a coincidence. He told himself that plainly. He believed it for about 90 seconds. The key turned hard, then gave. The door swung in on a lobby that smelled of dust and old velvet and the particular cold that lives inside buildings nobody heats. It was 11:18 in the morning. Light came through the cracked glass of the front doors and lay across a tile floor split into a pattern like the bed of a dried-up creek. There was a ticket booth with a brass grill. Behind the grill, a calendar still hung open to a month in 1989. There was a concession counter with its glass case intact, every shelf empty, every price still marked in a careful hand. Jonah walked in slow. He had learned a long time ago to enter a new place quietly, to read it before it read him. He passed the booth and pushed through a posset of pad doors into the house. The room opened up around him, taller than he had braced for. 200 seats in faded red, a balcony above, a stage at the front behind a curtain gone the color of weak tea. The roof had come down at the back corner. He could see daylight through the tarp, and a water stain spreading down the rear wall, and a drift of fallen plasters across the last few rows of seats. The rest of the room had held. The rest of the room was only waiting. He went up first before the stage because that was where the light was. A narrow stair off the lobby took him to the balcony, and a steeper one off the balcony took him to the projection booth. The booth was a small steel room with 2 round portholes cut in the wall, and behind the portholes stood 2 projectors, big as engines. Draped in canvas, he lifted a corner of the canvas. The machines were oiled. Somebody had kept them oiled long after there was anything left to show. There was a stool worn pale where a man had sat, and on the wall a strip of tape with the running times of films penciled beside it in a slanted hand. He stood in the booth a while and watched the dust turn in the light from the portholes. Then he came down to the stage. On the front edge of the stage, knocked over on its side, lay a small lamp on a stand, a single bulb in a wire cage. A long black cord trailed off into the dark of the wings. Jonah climbed the side steps onto the stage. He crouched and looked at the lamp a moment without touching it. Then he set it upright. That was how he had been raised in the 2 or 3 homes that had raised him decently, to leave a room a little better than he found it. Even a room that was coming down. You'll want to plug that back in. The voice came from the rear of the house, by the door to the alley. An old man stood there in a windbreaker, gone shiny at the elbows, hands pushed down in his pockets. He was thin and stooped. His white hair was cut close, and his face had spent its life half in shadow. He did not come closer. "It's been off 2 years," the man said. "Longest it's ever been off, I expect." "Who are you?" Jonah asked. "Calvin Threadgill. I worked this house 30-odd years." He nodded at the key still in Jonah's hand. "And you'd be the fella that bought it. Word travels in a town this size, faster than a man can drive down from Wheeling, apparently." Jonah said nothing. He had found that silence pulled more out of people than questions ever did. Calvin walked down the center aisle, slow, one hand brushing the seat backs as he came. He climbed onto the stage with the care of a man whose knees kept their own counsel now. He took a thermos from his coat and poured 2 cups without asking. He handed one up to Jonah, sat down on the lip of the stage, and let his legs hang over the edge into the dark of the pit. "That there," he said, pointing his cup at the little lamp, "is a ghost light. Every theater worth the name keeps one. You leave it burning center stage every night after the house goes dark, so the room's never all the way black. Folks'll tell you it's for the ghosts, keeps the spirits company, keeps 'em settled. And what do you tell them? I tell 'em it's so the first one in of a morning don't pitch off the edge into the pit and break his fool neck. Calvin took a slow drink. But I keep one anyhow. Both things can be true at once. Most things are. Jonah sat down beside him. The coffee was strong and a little burnt. It was the best thing he had tasted in a week. This town used to come here, Calvin said, looking out at the empty seats. Whole town. Saturday nights you couldn't get a seat after 7. They built it in 1923, back when the glass works was running 3 shifts and a man had money in his pocket of a weekend. It was a vaudeville house then. Singers, jugglers, a fellow with a trained dog that could count to 10 by stamping its foot. He smiled at nothing. The acts rode the circuit through here on the rail line, Pittsburgh down to Wheeling and on south, 2 days in each town and gone. There was a board out back where they'd chalk up the running order. There was a call boy whose only job was to knock the dressing room doors and sing out the minutes left till the curtain. Half this town's grandma had their first kiss in that balcony you just came down from. And then the movies. Then the talkies came in and they hung a screen up where the dancers used to stand. Folks said it was the end of the place. Calvin shook his head. It wasn't. Folks always think the new thing is the end of everything. It's just the next thing wearing a new coat. The seats filled up the same. Different reason, same seats. What ended it then? Television. Then the malls out by the interstate, with their 8 screens and their popcorn the size of a wash bucket. Then the glass works closed in 94. After that the town didn't have the weekend money no more, and a town without weekend money can't keep a picture house lit. He nodded at the room. But this one stayed open longer than it had any right to. You want to know why? Because Wendell wouldn't let it close. Calvin set down his cup. Wendell Carrick ran this place 40 years. Bought it himself in '86 when the last operator went belly up and walked away. Ran it on a shoestring in his own 2 hands. He's the one strung that ghost light. He's the one kept it lit, right up till the end. Calvin looked at him then. It was a long, careful look, the kind a man gives a thing he is trying to place. But he only said the name again, Carrick. Wendell Carrick, and he left it lying there between them. He did not ask the question that had come up plain on his face. He took Jonah back through the wings instead. A stage is a machine, he said, not just a floor, and a man ought to know how his own machine works. Along the wall ran a pin rail, a long oak beam set with iron pins. Tied off on the pins were ropes thick as a man's wrist, hemp gone stiff and gray with the years. The ropes ran up into the dark overhead, over wooden blocks, and down again to a row of canvas bags hung in a line. Sandbags, Calvin said. Counterweights. You want to fly a backdrop up out of sight, you load the bags to match its weight, and then one man can lift 400 pounds with his own 2 arms. The whole rig runs on balance, nothing else. Wendell could change a set in the dark with his eyes shut. I watched him do it more than once. He set both hands on a line and leaned his back, gentle, the way you test ice. The rope held, and somewhere up in the loft a block creaked, and a slat of light shifted across the back wall. See there. That backdrop's still flown out, up over our heads, been hanging up there since the last show. Balance so fine a child could bring it down. That was his work. A man can be careless his whole life in everything but the one thing, and Wendell's one thing was this. He let go of the line and frowned at the dry, splitting fibers under his palm. These are rotted through now, though. You so much as lean on one wrong, it'll let go and drop a bag on your head. Don't you go pulling on anything till you know which line carries what. At the back of the stage left wing, where there ought to have been a door to the dressing rooms, there was a wall instead. A sheet of plywood fitted into the frame and painted over the same dull green as the brick around it. A man not looking for it would walk past and never know it was there. Jonah looked at the wall. Calvin did not. What's back there? Jonah asked. Storage, Calvin said too quick and steered them on. In the prop room, on a shelf among coils of cable and a tin of grease paint dried to stone, lay an open notebook. A stage manager's logbook, the spine cracked, the pages soft as cloth. It lay open to a cue sheet for the last show the Bijou ever held, a high school graduation in June of 1989. Down the margin ran a column of notes in a careful slanted hand. House lights to half. Hold for the principal. Bring up warm on the diplomas. Jonah stood very still over the book. He knew that handwriting. He had spent 2 years of nights learning to read a hand exactly like it. by candlelight and by the glow of a cracked phone, in beds that were never his for long. He turned to the inside of the back cover. Written there in the same slant were 3 words, property of W. Carrick. He sat down hard on an overturned crate. He did not move for a long time. Outside, a coal train went through somewhere down by the river. The whole building shivered with it. A little more plaster sifted down at the back of the house like the first dry snow of a winter, still a long way off. The man from the borough office came on the 4th day. His name was Earl Pruitt, and he sat on the town council, and he came with a clipboard and a tape measure. He had the careful, apologizing manner of a man who has spent his life carrying news that other people made. He walked the building with Jonah a step behind him. He measured the sag in the rear joists. He noted the water damage and the failed corner and the missing handrail on the balcony stairs. He wrote each one down, saying to himself the way as some men hum at a graveside. "Son, I'll be straight with you, because you strike me as somebody who'd want it straight." He clicked his pen twice. "This building's been on the condemnation list 11 years. The only reason it's still standing is the county never wanted to pay to knock it down. Now it's yours. That means the liability's yours. And that means I've got to hand you a notice." "What kind of notice?" 30 days. You've got 30 days to show the borough a viable use plan, backed by a letter from a structural engineer saying the place can be made safe for the public. You do that, we sit down and talk about a path forward." Pruitt looked almost sorry to go on. "You don't, and we schedule the demolition. I don't make the rules, son. I just measure them and write them down." He left the notice on the concession counter, a single sheet under the cracked glass of an empty candy case. Jonah read it twice. 30 days, he had $68, no engineer, and a roof that let the sky come in. He spent the better part of the next day on the cracked phone, calling structural engineers out of a list the library in Wheeling printed for him. The first one did not call back. The second one quoted $1,200 just to walk the building and write the letter, and that was before a single board got fixed. The third one laughed, not unkindly, and asked if he was serious. And when Jonah said he was, the man went quiet and said, "Good luck, son," and meant it, which was somehow worse. $1,200. Jonah had 68. He sat on the lip of the stage with the ghost light beside him. He stacked his loose change into towers of 7 coins, knocked them flat, and stacked them up again. It was a thing his hands knew how to do when the rest of him did not. That night he stayed in the theater. He had returned the shelter truck and hitchhiked back, because there was no other way to do the thing he had quietly decided to do. He laid his canvas bag across a row of seats and tried to sleep and could not. So he lit the work light in the prop room, and he read. There were 3 logbooks in the cabinet, and they were not only cue sheets. Wendell had used them as journals too, in the wide margins and on the blank backs of the pages. 40 years of a man talking to himself in a slanted hand. Jonah read them in order. He read the way he ate when food was scarce, slow, making it last. The earliest book was 1986, the year Wendell bought the place. "Buyer beware," the first entry said. "Wendell, you old fool, the fly system wants new hemp, the boiler's shot, and I have spent every dollar I saved on a barn that shows movies to 40 people on a good night." Then, a few pages on, in a different ink and a plainer hand, this. "But the room is good. The room was always good. I have nowhere else in this world I would rather be broke." There were entries about money that never came and project bulbs that cost more than a week of groceries, and a January so cold the film cracked in the gate during the second reel. Folded between 2 pages, Jonah found a maintenance note he read 3 times over, because it was the most careful thing he had ever seen a man write down for his own use. To read a fly line when the hemp dries out, lower the bag to the deck slow and never let it run. Mark your trim first so you can find the height again after. Cut the old rope above the becket and save the becket. It's good brass, and brass don't grow on trees. Splice in new manila, wetted down so it seats tight. Reload the bags by hand, 1 shovelful at a time. Weight against the piece. Never guess the weight. A guess in this trade is a man on the floor with his skull stove in. Take the hour. Always take the hour. There is no job worth a life, and no life that can't spare an hour. He could not afford the one thing the borough wanted, so he did the things he could. That was a habit older than memory in him. The next morning he carried Wendell's note out to the pin rail and read it through twice. Then he picked the worst of the rotted lines, the one nearest the wall where a bag hung low and crooked. He worked the way the note said to work. He lowered the bag to the deck slow and would not let it run. He marked the trim height on the rail with a stub of chalk so he could find it again. He cut the old rope above the becket and saved the becket because the brass was good, and brass did not grow on trees. It took him most of the day. He wetted the new manila down in a bucket from the hardware store so it would seat. He spliced it the way the note showed in a small drawing in the margin over and under. His fingers were raw before he had the feel of it. He loaded the bag by hand, a coffee can of sand at a time, and weighed it against the piece, and never once guessed. Around 4 o'clock, Calvin appeared in the wing without a sound and stood watching, hat in hand. He did not offer to help. He let the boy do it. When the line was bedded and the bag hung true, Calvin walked over and set his weight on it the way he had that first day. The rope held clean. The block ran quiet overhead. "Huh," Calvin said. That was all. But he said it the way another man might have said a whole sentence. Jonah understood it. Something in his chest that had been clenched for 19 years let go by its single notch. On the 5th day, he drove the long way to the county seat to find out what, exactly, he had bought. The records office was one room with a counter and a wall of green ledgers, run by a woman named Marlene Sutter who had worked there 31 years and knew where everything was without looking. She pulled the file on the Bijou lot and laid it open on the counter and turned it so he could read it, right side up. "You're the boy who bought the theater," she said. It was not a question. Whole courthouse talked about it for a day. What did they say? That you'd lost your mind mostly. She almost smiled, and one or two said it was about time somebody did. The file went back to 1923. Marlene walked him through the chain of title with one finger, the way Calvin had walked him through the fly system. There was the original deed to the Opera House Company. There were the lean years and the foreclosure in the 30s. There was the transfer to W. Carrick in 1986, in a hand Jonah was coming to know. And clipped to the back, where it had no business being, was a single sheet of newer paper, a note from a probate attorney across the river, dated 2017. "That's odd," Marlene said, frowning at it. "Somebody opened a probate matter on this property 2 years before the man died. You don't usually see that. Estates get settled after, not before. What does it mean?" "It means he was making arrangements." She read the lawyer's name off the sheet and tapped it. "My brother handled probate up there before he retired. I could ask him what this is if you want. Might be nothing. Might be the man tying off a loose end." She looked at Jonah over the counter, and something in her face softened by a degree. "You favor him, you know." Around the eyes. "I waited on Wendell Carrick at this counter for years and never once thought to ask if he had people. Now here's his people, standing where he stood." Jonah did not answer. He did not yet know how to be somebody's people. But he took the lawyer's name down in the back of the logbook, in his own careful, taught himself hand just below the slant that was Wendell's. He ate that night at the diner on Main Street. He had not had a hot meal in 3 days, and the woman behind the counter waved him in off the sidewalk like she had been expecting him. Her name was Dot. She gave him meatloaf and gravy and would not write a ticket for it, and when he tried to argue, she set the coffee pot down hard enough to end the conversation. "You're fixing up the Bijou," she said. It had gone around the whole town by then. "My mother courted my father in the back row of that house in 1951. Said he was too cheap to spring for the loge seats. She wiped the counter that did not need wiping. There's not a soul over 50 in this town doesn't have a night they remember in that building. We just got used to it being shut. You get used to anything if you let yourself." 2 old men at the counter turned on their stools. One of them said he'd seen his first picture there at 6 and cried at the train and had to be carried out. The other said he'd proposed in the lobby under the clock and got turned down and married her anyway. They told it like a thing they had told before and liked telling. The whole room leaned in a little. For a few minutes, the boy who had never belonged anywhere sat in the middle of a town remembering itself out loud, and nobody asked him a single thing about where he had come from. Calvin came by in the mornings with the thermos. He never knocked. He would simply be there on the lip of the stage, as if he had grown up out of the boards in the night. On the 6th morning, Jonah asked him the thing he had been carrying around since the deed. "His people," Jonah said. "Where did they go?" Calvin was quiet a while. He turned his cup slow in his hands. "Wendell's people put him out," he said at last. "Long time back, 68 it would have been. I won't tell you why, it isn't mine to tell. The why was theirs, and the shame was theirs, and not one bit of it was ever his." He looked at the ghost light righted now on its stand. He never went home after. never sat in a pew with them, never carved a turkey at their table. His mama took sick in '81 and he came back to Linton to nurse her. She let him do it, and she still wouldn't say his name to the neighbors who came by. He stayed anyway. He buried her, and then he stayed. A man'll stay in the one place that lets him be of use, even if it's a leaky barn full of empty chairs. Calvin shook his head, slow. I were satisfied Shima near 40 years. Knew his coffee, knew his temper, knew the way he'd whistle low when a cue went clean. There were whole years I didn't know where he laid his head at night. He kept that to himself. He kept most things to himself. It was how he was made, and it was how they made him. The old man rubbed his thumb along the rim of his cup. I'll tell you the one thing I do know. Every Christmas, far as back as I can recall, he'd drive over to Wheeling on the morning of, alone, and be back by dark and never say where. I asked him once. He just said paying a call. Never another word on it. I let it lie. You learn to let a man's quiet places lie. Did he have anybody at the end? Calvin did not answer that one right away. He looked at the floor of the stage as if the answer were written in the grain of it. Then he finished his coffee and said he had to see a man about a furnace, and he went, which was its own kind of answer. Jonah read the middle book that night, the 1995 one. It was thinner than the others, and the entries came further apart, the way a man writes less when there is less he can stand to say. There were cue sheets for second-run films nobody else would screen anymore, westerns and weepers the studios had forgotten. There were ticket counts that dropped year over year, written down anyway, the way you keep weighing a thing even after you know. And in the spring of that year, one entry that was not about the theater. Theodore would have been 60 today, it said. We never did get to be old men together, which was the only plan either of us ever made out loud. I kept the lobby clock running on his account. He could not abide a stopped clock. Said a stopped clock was a small lie a building told about itself, and a building ought to be honest if a man couldn't be. So I wind it Sundays. There is no one left to mind whether it keeps time but me, and I mind. Jonah set the book down and went out into the lobby with the work light. There was a clock above the ticket booth he had not looked at twice. It was stopped at 4:10. He stood under it a long while. Then he found the brass key for it tucked behind the booth on a little hook, and he wound it because somebody had to mind, and there was no one left now but him. If you have come this far with Jonah, into this cold building with the sky showing through the roof, then stay with me now. Because what he found behind that painted-over wall is the part I have wanted to tell you since the fog first touched the boy's shoes. It was the 7th night when he opened the last logbook, the 2017 one, and read it all the way to the back. Near the end he came to an entry that was not about the theater at all. The ink was pressed hard into the paper, the way a man writes when his hand is shaking and he is fighting it to hold still. Saw a name in the paper today I haven't seen in 50 years, Wendell had written. Pearl's girl had a boy. The girl is gone now, the article said. Some trouble I won't set down here, and the boy is in the county homes, and the boy is alone. Jonah closed the book. He laid his hand flat on the cover. Then he opened it and read the words a second time, slower because Pearl had been his grandmother's name. Pearl's girl had been his mother, and the boy in the county homes who was alone had been him. He stood up too fast. The crate tipped and clattered over behind him. He crossed the dark stage to the back wall, to the plywood painted green to hide it. He put both hands flat against it. He felt along the edge until his fingers found the seam. Calvin, he said into the empty house, though Calvin had gone home hours before. Calvin, what's back here? He came back at first light with a crowbar from the hardware store, bought with 11 of his last dollars. Calvin was already there, sitting on the stage edge, the thermos beside him untouched. The old man did not try to stop him. He only watched, with his hat held in both hands, as Jonah set the bar against the seam and pulled. The plywood came away in 2 long pieces. It made a sound like a held breath let go at last. A smell rolled out from behind it that was not dust and not rot, but something almost warm. It was the smell of a place where a person had once lived. Behind the wall was a door, an ordinary door deadbolted from the inside. Hanging on a nail beside it, on a loop of leather worn black with handling, was a key. Calvin stood up slow. He did not reach for the key. He folded his hands over his hat and looked down at the boards. He lived back there, the old man said quietly. The last 5 years when he couldn't make rent in town no more. Slept behind his own stage and never told a living soul. He didn't want it getting back to the borough, was scared they'd shut him down for it. Calvin's voice caught, and he let it catch and went on. I'm the only one who knew. He made me promise. One Sunday I came to fetch him for the matinee, and he didn't answer the bell. Found him in there, in that little room. 2 days gone. And the ghost light? Still burning, out here on the stage, where he'd left it the night before, same as every night for 40 years. Calvin turned his hat over once in his hands. I never went back in that room after. Couldn't. The undertaker's men carried him out, and I put the bolt across, and I painted that board over the door myself the week after the funeral. Told myself it was, so the borough wouldn't find he'd been living here and hold it against the place. That was part of it. He looked at the green plywood lying split on the floor. The other part was I couldn't stand to look at where he'd been small. A man like that, you don't want to know how small the world had got for him at the end. Jonah took the key down off the nail. It was warm from his own hand or from nothing at all. Calvin stepped back into the wing. Go on, he said. It's not mine. Never was. I just kept the door shut on it. He turned half away, the way a man does at a graveside when the box goes down. You go on in. He'd want it to be blood that opened it if it was going to be anybody. Jonah fit the key to the lock. He stood there a moment with his hand on it. It was the way he had stood across the street that first foggy morning, not yet ready to cross into the thing that was about to be his. Then he turned it, and the door swung inward on the smallest, neatest room either of them had ever stood before. The room was no bigger than a box stall. A cot stood against one wall, made up tight, the blanket squared at the corners. It was the way a man learns to do it in the service, or in homes like the ones that had raised Jonah. There was a small desk under a single bulb, a hot plate with one ring, a wash basin, a shaving mirror gone cloudy at the edges, and a row of shirts hung on nails, each one pressed, though there had been no one left to press them for. It did not smell of death. That was the thing Jonah had braced for and did not find. It smelled of pencil shavings and lamp oil and old paper. It smelled of a man who had worked with his hands in a small clean space for a long time, and had kept the space the way he kept everything, which was carefully. He stood in the doorway a moment before he stepped in. He had learned young not to walk too fast into a room that belonged to someone else, even when the someone else was gone, especially then. On the desk lay a row of pencils. Every one of them was sharpened to the same length, about 2.5 inches, then set aside in a line like soldiers, stood down. A coffee tin held the longer ones, waiting their turn. Jonah picked one up and turned it in the light. Later Calvin would tell him that Wendell never wrote with a pencil once it dropped below a certain length. Said a worn-down stub made a man write careless on the cue sheet, and a careless cue Wendell held could drop a curtain on somebody's head. Beside the pencil sat a small brass bell on a wooden handle. It was a call bell, the kind a stage manager rings to bring the actors up from their dressing rooms before the house opens. The brass had been rubbed so often and so long that the engraving on the side had nearly worn away. Jonah tilted it toward the bulb and could just make out the letters. W.C. He set it down soft so it would not ring in the quiet. There were books on a shelf above the cot. Not many. A worn paperback of stage directions, a county history, a Bible like his mother's, but this one barely opened, the spine still stiff. And the lobby clock's winding key hung on a nail, the one Wendell had used every Sunday on Theodore's account, for a man who could not abide a stopped clock. There was a photograph on the desk in a dime store frame, a young woman on a porch step, squinting into the sun, holding a baby against her shoulder. The baby's face was turned away from the camera. But Jonah knew the porch. He knew the cracked second step. He knew the railing with one baluster gone. It was the porch and the only memory he had of being small and safe, and the woman holding the child was his mother. He sat down on the edge of the cot and held the picture in both hands. He did not move for a long time. Somewhere out in the house, water dripped through the tarp and found the floor, slow, the way it had been finding it for years. The desk had one drawer. Inside it, laid flat and squared like everything else in the room, were 3 things. A manila folder, soft with handling, a bank passbook underneath it, and under the passbook, 2 envelopes that had never been mailed. The envelopes were sealed. One had gone yellow with age, the other was newer. Neither had a stamp and neither had an address, only a name written across the front in that slanted hand. Both of them said the same thing, to Pearl's grandchild. Jonah opened the passbook first, because numbers were easier than names. It was a savings account at a bank across the river, opened in 1986 and never closed. The deposits were small and regular, a little every month for 33 years, the patient arithmetic of a man who spent almost nothing on himself. The last balance was written in pencil in the same careful hand, $87,000. He set the passbook down and opened the folder. The papers inside were legal, and most of the words were the kind he had to read 3 times to hold. But the top sheet was a letter from a probate attorney across the river. It was the same name Jonah had copied into the back of the logbook 2 days before, Marlene's brother. The letter explained, in the flat, careful language of such men, what Wendell had done. In 2017, Mr. Carrick had placed $56,000 into a trust. The money was to sit untouched against the day that any heir of the Carrick blood came forward and claimed the theater by lawful transfer of title. If no one ever came, it was to go to the volunteer fire department. Somebody had to be kept warm. The attorney quoted him as saying, even if it isn't kin, $87,000 and $56,000, $143,000. Set aside 1 slow month at a time by a man who slept on a cot in a closet behind a stage and pressed his own shirts by hand. Jonah did not feel rich. He had imagined in the bad years what money might feel like, and it had never felt like this. This felt like a hand laid flat and warm on the back of his neck. He set the folder down on the cot beside him. He looked at the 2 envelopes a while. Then he took up the newer one, the one that had not yellowed. He worked his thumb under the flap. He unfolded the pages, and he read them by the light of the single bulb. To Pearl's grandchild, whoever you turn out to be. I have written this letter 4 times and burned 3 of them. This is the 4th. I am too old now to be sure of a 5th, so it will have to stand as it is. You do not know me, and there is no reason you should. My name is Wendell Carrick. I am your grandmother Pearl's brother, which makes me something to you that has no tidy word. Great uncle, I suppose. A man you have never met writing to a child he has never seen. I know how that reads. I have read it back to myself and burned it twice for the shame of how it reads. Here is the plain of it. In the fall of 1968, my family put me out of the house. The reasons were theirs to decide and mine to carry. I will not set them down here. They were never the truth of me, and I will not let them be the last thing I tell you. I went away for a long time. I came back when my mother was dying, and I nursed her, and she let me. She never once said my name where a neighbor could hear it. I buried her. Then I stayed, because the theater on Bijou Street would let me be of use, and a man will plant himself wherever he is allowed to be of use. I made a life here. It was a smaller life than some and a richer one than most. I had a friend in it for a while who made it richer still. Then I did not have him anymore. I have kept the lobby clock wound on his account ever since, because he could not abide a stopped clock, and because somebody ought to mind. I tell you this so you will know I was not only a thing that was sent away. I was a man who kept a building alive past its time. That is a thing worth being. In the spring of 2017, I saw a name in the newspaper, your name. I learned that Pearl's girl was gone, and that there was a boy of hers in the county homes, and that the boy was alone. I knew that aloneness. I have worn it like a coat my whole life. I tried to send word. I drove to Wheeling and sat in the lot outside that building 3 different times. But the family had closed itself like a fist 50 years before, and what could I have offered a boy except a man whose own mother wouldn't? I have set things in order. The theater is yours if you came in through the front of it, which means you found your own way and owe no one for the finding. The money is yours. It is not much. It is everything I had, which is a different measure than much. Keep the ghost light on. It is the one thing I never let go dark. In 40 years, through every winter, the boiler failed. A room that has had life in it should not be made to sit in the dark, even when there is no one left to see. Especially then. I was not able to be your family while I lived. I have tried to be it from here, which is a poor substitute, and I know it. But it is what I had. A man gives what he has. Jonah read it through once fast and once slow. Then he folded it along the creases Wendell had made. He held it against his chest with the flat of his hand. It was the way he had held the photograph a moment before. It was the way he had held his mother's Bible on the truck seat, 40 miles down the river, the day all this began. The understanding came to him in 3 turns, the way a key turns in a stiff lock. The first turn was simple, and it was personal. The man who had kept this room, who had pressed these shirts and saved these dollars and rubbed this bell down to nothing, was his blood. Not a stranger. Not a caseworker or a placement that ran out in 6 months. Blood. Jonah Carrick had people in the world after all, and one of them had slept 30 feet from where he now sat. The second turn was harder, and it had to do with the years. Wendell had known. For 2 years before he died, The old man had known there was a boy of pearls lying alone in the world. He had not been able to cross the distance the family had built 50 years before, and it had cost him something to fail at it. The trust had opened in 2017, the same spring he read the name. He had set the money aside the very week he learned the boy existed. Then he had died not knowing whether anyone would ever come for it. The third turn was the one Jonah could not have put into words and did not try to. The hand that had cast Wendell out of the family in 1968 had been his own great-grandmother's hand. The same bloodline that shut the door had walked back through it 58 years later. It had come in the shape of a boy who paid $5 at a county auction because the words theater and $5 would not leave him alone in the night. The line had bent. It had not broken. It had only taken the long way around. He did not open the older envelope, the yellowed one. He held it a while and turned it over in his hands, and then he laid it back in the drawer, sealed, where Wendell had left it. Some things were meant for a Pearl's grandchild that Wendell had been picturing across a longer stretch of years. Some things stay where they are left. Jonah had learned that young. He was not going to undo a dead man's choices about what to say and what to keep. He stayed in the room a long time after that. He took his mother's Bible out of his coat and set it on the shelf, beside Wendell's, the worn one next to the stiff one. They did not look like they belonged together. A book read to pieces and a book barely opened, but they were the only two Carrick things left in the world that he knew of. Now they stood on the same shelf. It seemed to him like one small thing he could mend of all the things the family had broken. He turned the bulb off when he left. Then he stood in the dark a second and turned it back on, because the letter had told him to, and because he wanted to. Calvin was still in the wing when Jonah came back out, sitting on an apple crate with his hat in his lap. He did not ask what was in the room. He looked at Jonah's face and seemed to find the answer there, and he nodded once, slow, the way a man nods at a graveside. "He was your kin," Calvin said. "It was not a question." "My grandmother's brother." Calvin let out a long breath through his nose and looked at the floor. 40 years, he said. 40 years I worked beside that man and called him friend. He never once told me he had blood in this world. He'd have rung that bell clean off its handle before he'd have asked anybody for a thing. He stood, and his knees cracked, and he set his hat on his head. Well, he left it for somebody, and somebody came. That's more than most men get, and a sight more than he'd have let himself hope for. Jonah did not touch the $143,000 for himself. He thought about it the first night, the way a person who has been hungry thinks about money, with a kind of fear. He could have walked away. He could have sold the lot for the land, taken the trust, and rented a clean apartment in Wheeling with a door that locked and stayed locked. No one would have blamed him. Calvin would not have. The town would not have. But the letter had not asked him to be comfortable. It had asked him to keep a light on, so he put the savings against the roof and the wiring and the seats. He put the trust in a separate account at the same bank across the river to run the place when the ticket money fell short, which it would. He kept $300 out for himself, for boots and a coat that fit, because a man has to be warm enough to do the work. The rest went back into the building, dollar by dollar, the same patient way it had been saved. It did not feel like a sacrifice. It felt like the only honest thing to do with money a man had gathered one slow month at a time for a boy he never met. Earl Pruitt came back on the day before the notice ran out. Marlene had helped Jonah file the papers, the trust claim, and a use application with the borough. She had sat with him across the records counter and walked him through each line, the way she had walked him through the chain of title. Her brother confirmed the trust was good and disbursed it without a fuss. So when Pruitt came through the front doors with his clipboard, Jonah had a folder of his own to set on the cracked glass of the candy case. But Pruitt did not look at the folder first. He walked into the house and he stopped. The seats had been swept. The fallen plaster was cleared off the back rows. The rotted fly lines were down, and 3 of them re-rigged in new Manila, wetted and spliced and weighted true, and on the front edge of the stage the ghost light was burning. Jonah had spent a whole evening tracing the outlet back to a live circuit. Now the one bulb glowed in its wire cage in the middle of the afternoon, small and steady, throwing its light up into the dark of the flies. Pruitt looked at it a while. He was not a man much given to looking at things. "That the original lamp?" he asked. "My wife's mother ushered here, 1950s. Pruitt clicked his pen, then seemed to forget he was holding it. She used to say the place was never all the way dark, even after it shut. Said you could drive past at 2 in the morning and see the one light burning in there, and it made the whole street feel less like something had died on it. He was quiet a moment. I always figured she'd gone sentimental in her old age. Didn't know there was somebody up here keeping it lit on purpose. He did not say he was sorry. Jonah would turn that over later and decide it had been the right thing not to say. Pruitt only looked at the light a while longer. Then he took the use application off the candy case and tucked it under his clipboard without reading it. "I'll write it up favorable," he said. Demonstrated stewardship. "That's a real category, even if nobody around here's used it in 20 years. There's a historic structures fund the county's been sitting on. I'll find your engineer money in it." He turned for the door. "It's not strictly my job to do that, but it's not my job to knock down the one light this town's got left either. I'll measure it the way it needs measuring." Then he was gone. The house went quiet, and the ghost light burned on into the empty seats, the way it had for 40 years before anyone thought to ask it why. That evening, Jonah drove up to the Methodist cemetery on the hill above the river. Marlene had told him where the family plot was. Wendell lay in the corner of it, in the patch the family had given him at the end after refusing him the middle of it for life. The stone was small and plain. Wendell Carrick, it read, and the years and nothing else. No verse, no beloved, just the name and the span of it. Jonah took the brass call bell out of his coat. He set it on top of the headstone, in the cold, where the wind off the river could find it. He did not know what to say to a man he had never met. He had spent 19 years not knowing what to say to anyone. The cold ground in front of him did not make it any easier, so he said nothing at all. He sat down on the grass beside the small plain stone. He let the wind say it for him. After a while, the light went out of the sky over the water. He drove the long way home in the dark, and the dark did not feel as empty as it had the night before. 8 months later, on a Friday evening in June, the marquee of the Bijou Theater came on for the first time in 35 years. It did not happen all at once. Nothing about it had. The roof took most of the winter. The collapsed corner was framed back up by a volunteer crew, who came on Saturday mornings with their own tools and their own coffee. The lumber for it was donated out of the old glassworks yard, which had sat behind a chain-link fence since 1994, full of good seasoned timber nobody had been allowed to touch. Calvin ran the rigging crew from a folding chair, pointing with his cane, making the younger men do it twice when they did it wrong the first time. The seats were patched, not replaced. The lobby tile was regrouted in its dry creek pattern instead of torn out. Jonah had decided that early, and held to it through every contractor who told him it would be cheaper to gut the place. He was not going to make the building new. He had spent his whole life being handed things that other people had made new and clean and empty of any history he could call his. He was going to keep this one the way it had been kept. The town came in around him as the months went on, a little at a time, the way trust comes to a person who has learned to expect the worst. It started sending plate lunches over with whoever was driving past the theater. The hardware store owner stopped charging him for small things, then for large ones, and waved him off when he tried to settle up. A retired electrician spent 3 Saturdays tracing the building's wiring for nothing but the coffee and the company. None of them said much about why. In a town like Linton, help did not come with a speech attached. It came with a casserole and a tape measure, and a man already kneeling at your fuse box before you thought to ask. Calvin taught him the booth that winter. They went up to the steel room with the 2 portholes most evenings. The old man showed him how the projectors worked, the threading path, the carbon arc, the changeover between reels that had to be timed down to the second. Josto was slow at first. His hands wanted to rush, the way they wanted to stack coins, and a film gate does not forgive a rushed hand. So Calvin made him do it over and over. The same way Wendell had once made Calvin do it, 50 years before, in the same room, by the same light. There is a way a craft moves down through hands that never planned to be teachers. Calvin was passing Jonah something that Wendell had passed to him, and none of the 3 of them had ever said a word about love while doing it. The dressing room behind the stage he left exactly as it was. He had a glazier set a pane of glass into the doorframe where the painted plywood had been, so that a person could look in but not disturb. The cot stayed made. The shirts stayed pressed on their nails. The pencils stayed in their line, sharpened to 2.5 inches. The photograph stayed on the desk, the young woman squinting into a sun-long set. People would come to look in the years ahead. Most would not understand what they were seeing. A few would, and those few would stand there longer than the rest. They came for the opening. The whole town came, which was not the crowd it had once been, but it filled the seats, and that had not happened in this room since before most of them could remember. Jonah had put the word out the only way that worked in Linton. Through Dot's diner, through the church bulletins, through Calvin's telephone, which still hung on a kitchen wall and still had a cord. Admission was free for anyone who could remember the place when it ran. Free for anyone over 60. He had thought hard about that, and decided it was right. They came up the cracked sidewalk in their good coats. The two old men from the diner came, the one who had cried at the train at 6 years old, and the one who had proposed under the lobby clock, and got turned down and married her anyway. She came too on his arm, 90 years old and steady on her feet. A widow came with her grown daughter and stood a long while in the lobby, looking up at the clock that Jonah kept wound on Sundays now. She kept it the way Wendell had, the way Theodore would have wanted. Dot came out of her apron for once in her life. Marlene came and brought her brother. Earl Pruitt came and sat in the back row and did not take a single note. There was a boy among them too, 15 or so, who did not sit. His name was Denny, and his grandfather had ushered the Bijou in the 60s, and the boy had started turning up at the theater that spring with nothing in particular to do. Jonah had not turned him away. Nobody had ever turned Jonah away from a place he wanted to be, not in the homes that raised him decently, and he meant to be one of the decent ones now. So Calvin had put the boy to work in the booth, learning the threading path and the changeover, the same slow way he had taught Jonah, the same slow way Wendell had once taught him. The craft had somewhere to go now. That mattered more than Jonah could have said. They sat down in the velvet seats, the old ones, the patched ones, and a sound went through the room that Jonah had not expected, and would not forget. It was the sound of 100 people breathing in at once. The heat had come back into the pipes that winter, and with it the smell of the place had returned, dust and velvet and warm carbon. It was the smell of their childhoods. Every one of them had believed it gone for good, and here it was again, in their throats, in the dark. An old man near the front took off his hat and held it in his lap, the way men do in church, and did not seem to know he had done it. Calvin had tracked down a print of an old roadshow picture from the late 50s, a Western nobody had screened in decades. It came in steel cans from an archive in Pittsburgh. He threaded it himself, up in the booth, slow, his hands remembering the work. He laced the film through the gate and around the sprockets and down into the take-up reel, the way he had done 10,000 times before they closed the place. Up in the steel room, with the two round portholes, the projector began to turn. The beam came down through the dust and lay against the screen. The room filled with a light it had been waiting 35 years to hold. Jonah did not watch the picture. He had stood in the stage left wing a few minutes before the house lights went down, alone with the murmur of the full room coming through the curtain. He had thought about saying something into the dark of the flies, the way a man does when he is standing where another man stood for 40 years. He did not have the words. He had never had them. So he had only laid his hand flat on the cold pin rail, where Wendell's hand had rested 10,000 times. He left it there a moment. That had been the whole of what he could manage. It had felt like enough. He stood in the stage left wing now, where Wendell had stood for 40 years. He reached down and took the handle of the ghost light. He wheeled it on its stand off the center of the stage, back into the wing, out of the way of the show. That was what you did when the house was live, and the lamp's night work was done for a while. He set it where he could see it. The one bulb burned steady in its wire cage, small against the great beam of the picture. It did not go out. It was not going to. In the third row sat an old woman with her hands folded in her lap, watching the screen. She leaned toward the man beside her, who might have been her son. He always kept the light on, she said. We all knew. She did not say who. She did not have to. Jonah never learned what Wendell's last words had been, or whether there had been any at all. The old man had died alone in the small clean room behind the stage. The only person who ever found him was Calvin, and all Calvin could ever bring himself to say about it was that the room had been warm, and the light out front had been burning. Some things stay where they are left. Jonah had learned that young, and he was not going to pretend otherwise now, not even on a night like this one. He had not been adopted. No one had come to claim him in the way the county forms always seemed to promise, and never delivered. He was 19, and then he was 20. He owned a theater in a town with no traffic light. He owned a great uncle he would never shake hands with, and a room behind a stage that he had chosen to keep exactly the way it had been kept for him. It was not the family anyone draws up on a form. It was the one he had. But the seats were full. The people in them were remembering out loud a town that had once gathered in this room week after week, before the work went away and the young people went after it. And a boy who had spent his whole life being moved from one house to the next, never the right one, never for long, stood in the wing of a building that was his. He watched a roomful of near strangers become, for one evening, something close to kin. The picture ran to its end. The house lights came up slow, warm, and unhurried, the way Wendell's old cue sheets always called for, so that no one would be startled out of the dark too fast. The people gathered their coats. They did not leave right away. They stood in the aisles and the lobby and told each other things they had not told in years. The 90-year-old woman who had married the man she once turned down stopped Jonah by the candy case. She took his hand in both of hers, which were small and cold and certain. She told him she had not set foot in this building since 1971, and she had not known, until tonight, how much of herself she had left in it. Then she patted his hand twice and let it go, and her husband walked her out under the lit marquee, slow into the June dark. A few of the others came up to him too. They put a hand on his arm and they said his great-uncle's name, Wendell. They said it the way you say the name of a man who was good to the town, a man the town had been slow to thank. One of them said he never knew Wendell had any family. Another said he was glad, after everything, that the man had turned out to have some after all. They said the name like it was a good word, which in that room, on that night, after 58 years, it had finally come to be. Jonah took each hand that was offered and did not say much, because he had never had the words, and because none seemed to be needed. When they had all gone home, Jonah turned off the house lights and the marquee out front. He left the ghost light burning, center stage, where he had wheeled it back after the last coat went out the door. He sat down in the front row a while, in the dark, with the one small light in front of him. He did not feel alone in the way he had felt alone for 19 years. He could not have explained the difference to anyone. He did not try. The ghost light had kept watch through 40 winters and one long dark. Someone long before him had thought to leave it on, and now there was someone to keep it lit. Keep the ghost light on. That was the one thing the old man asked, in a letter he wrote 4 times and was never sure anyone would read. I keep coming back to that. Most of us aren't waiting to be rescued. We're waiting to be seen, to find out somebody left a light on for us before we ever knew their name. I changed the names in the town for this one, and I dramatized more than a little, but the feeling underneath it I didn't make up. If there's a person in your life you've quietly kept a light on for, you don't need to tell me about it down in the comments. Just maybe let them know it's still burning. Linton isn't on any map, but the part that matters is real enough.